Right concentration. And there's been some talk of how the word concentration isn't probably the right translation. Isn't probably the best word to use. I don't think it's that bad. I mean, I think obviously when we talk about samadhi, we're talking about it in contrast or in complement to effort. So if you have lots of effort but no concentration, you get distracted. If you have lots of concentration but not enough effort, you fall asleep. So I think it's pretty clear what we're talking about. And to that extent, concentration isn't one of those things that you can't get enough of. I mean, only mindfulness really works in that way, that you want to constantly be developing it. And so there's quite a bit of debate over the role of concentration and the nature of right concentration. Something that I could go on about for quite a while, and I have talked about, and it's something that is hotly debated. But the gist of it is that the Buddha talked often about specific types of concentration, which he called jhanas. Jhana means something like meditation. The word itself is used in several different ways. It's used to describe when the Bodhisattva stopped breathing. He practiced the jhana of not breathing. So it just means is he did some sort of meditation. Probably isn't the right word, but we use it in that sense. It was a development, or it was a jhana, right? He entered into this fixed state of, he fixed himself on. The Buddha would just, when he wanted the monks to meditate, he would say Jayata Bhikkhu. Sorry. Jayata is, I think, the same root as jhana. Jhana is the noun. Jayati is the verb. Jayata, meditate. Focus your attention. But the Buddha talked about 4 jhanas, and there are 8 or 9 jhanas in total, but most often he talked about 4 of them. And so there's a lot of debate over what exactly these mean, and I think with good reason, because it's not entirely clear or entirely certain. I mean, there's room clearly for interpretation, and there's the rub because people interpret them differently. But briefly, the jhanas involve states of wholesome concentration, where the mind is removed from worldly affairs. There's some sense that in certain types of jhana, and I would personally argue that there are many ways of talking about jhana, but in certain types of jhana, one doesn't even hear anything or see anything. It's totally oblivious to the world around. One is so focused on a single object that the rest of the world disappears. So that's really a trance state. When we talk about the jhanas, we often refer to these trance-like states. And why there are 4 is because they become increasingly subtle. So the first jhana, one is observing the object. One's mind is intent upon perceiving the object again and again and again, and contemplating it. So there's this sense of approaching the object and kind of sticking with it. That's the first jhana. It's also accompanied by rapture, so there's a sense of ecstasy involved, like excitement in a sense, this charge, this energy, if you will. And there's happiness, and there's single-pointedness, so the mind is continuously focused on a single object. That's the first jhana. In the second jhana, there's no more thinking about the object in the sense of sending the mind out to the object. The mind is stuck on the object, and it's so constant that there's no need for application or contemplation. The mind is simply with the object, one with the object, if you will. It's the second jhana. So the first two factors disappear, what we call vitaka and vichara. But there's still rapture, there's still happiness, and there's still single-pointedness. In the third jhana, rapture disappears. So there's not this excitement. The mind becomes more refined, and it's just fixed and focused on the object. That's the third jhana. In the fourth jhana, but there's still, in the third jhana, there's still happiness and single-pointedness. And in the fifth jhana, happiness disappears. But it doesn't mean there's no feeling. Happiness is replaced by equanimity. So there's still these two factors of upekkha and ekagata, equanimity and one-pointedness. So the idea is that through practicing focused meditation, what we call samatha meditation generally, you enter into more and more refined states. And it's usually based on a conceptual object. And this is why we kind of limit our interest in samatha meditation. Not because it's not helpful, it's actually quite powerful. And the Buddha talked about how this type of meditation can lead to magical powers, because you're very much in control of the mind. But the key there is control. It ends up being a bit of a problem because you can get stuck on it. You can get caught up in these powers. As Ajahn Chah said, it's based on clinging. I don't know if I would use such strong language, but it's interesting that he would say such a thing when many of his followers are adamant at it being the path to enlightenment. So this is one way of practicing, and it's often referred to as right concentration. The Buddha certainly, that's when he talked about right concentration, he most often talked about these four states of mind. But we'll get back to that in a second. When we enter into these states in ordinary meditation, we have to remember again, when we talk about the Noble Path, we're talking about this moment where your mind is perfect, right? That moment can't come through samatha meditation. I mean, samatha meditation isn't that moment. So to talk about those states of ordinary meditation as though they are right concentration is just clearly wrong. Those states are a precursor, potentially, like a practice, if you will. They certainly get the mind more focused and prepare one for the ultimate focus on the Four Noble Truths and Nibbana. But they aren't and shouldn't be mistaken for enlightenment. So this is one way of approaching the path, where you develop these first, and based on them, then insight comes after. And when insight and concentration are samatha and vipassana are both perfect, there's enlightenment. That's one way. The way we do it, and really the way a lot of people talk about it, we argue, we hear these arguments, but in the end, if you listen to people, they're mostly talking about the same thing. They're mostly not talking about that. Most traditions, especially the ones that argue about this, don't practice that type of meditation. They practice meditation where you're developing insight and tranquility in union. And Ajahn Chah was big on this. Just to use him, not because I follow his teachings, but because a lot of people on the other side of this argument do follow his teachings. I mean, Ajahn Chah was clear that they should come together. And so, he said various things. I won't use him he's not my favorite source of authority. I mean, there were monks that were far more, I think, versed in the actual texts, if you want to find an authority of what's in the text. And I go a little bit more towards that. But if you focus on in this way, if you practice in this way, then they come together. You never really enter into these trance states where you're blissful and peaceful. There may come bliss and peace, but you're cultivating a different type of jhana. And the jhana doesn't come. When people talk about the jhanas as being right concentration, being necessary, totally agree. I think it's a problem that we argue about this, when in fact the orthodoxy is quite clear. When you get to Nibbana, at that moment there's no question you're in a jhana. There's no question you're in one of the 4 jhanas. Usually, in our case, it would be the first jhana, or it would be considered the first jhana because you haven't cultivated the other jhanas. But at that moment, it's a jhana based on Nibbana, and that's right concentration. To be clear, what the Buddha seems most often to have talked about is these mundane jhanas. And most often that's understood to be a trance state that involves a lot of magic and exalted states, can even lead you to the Brahma realms. So the Buddha had this sort of comprehensive practice that he got his monks to undertake. And it was quite powerful, but it was also completely mundane. These magical powers certainly aren't enlightenment. And the states of trance also aren't enlightenment. But they're powerful and they're supportive, they're wholesome. But if you look at the wording of the various jhanas, it seems often as well the Buddha was talking about something a little different. He was talking about this practice of samatha and vipassana together because you're mindful. So it appears in some sense that one can practice jhana based on ultimate reality, which makes sense because of course the word jhana just means meditation. So the commentary picks up on this and talks about 2 types of jhana. Lakkanupani jhana, aramanupani jhana, and lakkanupani jhana. These are the words. And again it refers to these 2 types of jhana. So one is, aramana means an object. So this is samatha meditation, where you're meditating and you're fixed and focused on a single object, a concept. And because you're focused on that one object, you'll never see impermanent suffering and non-self. As a result, you'll never see, just by focusing on that object, you'll never see Nibbana. The other one, Lakkanupani jhana, is where you're focused and fixed on the 3 characteristics. It's a focus on reality. And the 3 characteristics, seeing them, means it's a state of complete tranquility as well. Because seeing the 3 characteristics, there is no reaction. You see that the things that we would normally cling to are not worth clinging to. They're not worth getting upset about. So it's also right concentration. And it should also be considered jhana, in a sense. If you ever read what the various teachers say on the word jhana, nobody agrees anyway. So I think this is one case where we see people getting often too caught up in their own definition of a word. Sometimes it's true, a word has to be defined in a specific way, but it appears the word jhana should not be. There are clearly jhanas that are unwholesome and jhanas that are wholesome, that's clear. But in regards to those that are wholesome, there appears to be a definite amount of leeway. And those people who argue that your way is wrong and so on, are in this case, I would say, being overly dogmatic, probably on both sides. So I don't know, hopefully that's cleared up this whole idea of right concentration. For those of you who aren't aware of this whole debate, the point here is that your mind has to be fixed and focused. Your mind has to be in a wholesome state. The real characteristic that I haven't mentioned of concentration is that it frees you of the 5 hindrances. And so just another point as to, some people say you have to enter into the jhanas before you begin to practice mindfulness, and I think that's quite absurd because you have to be mindful of the hindrances. The Buddha was quite clear that when anger arises, rather than saying, okay, get rid of the anger, you should be mindful of it. So clearly there's some leeway here. Yes, you can enter into states where there is no greed, no anger, no greed and no anger anyway. But it's clearly not the only way. I mean, if there's anger in the mind, the way of mindfulness is to be mindful of the anger. And as a result of that, hey, your concentration improves. And eventually you enter into a jhana, which means you enter into a state where there's no more anger, where you're still experiencing things, seeing, hearing, smelling, but you have equanimity about them. Mahasi Sayadaw goes into detail about, it's kind of a bit speculative, about the idea of there being vipassana jhanas. And I think all he's saying is that, hey, let's not be quite so dogmatic when there's no reason to, and there's certainly no backing for it or basis for it in the Buddha's teaching. Jhana is something that just means the wholesome concentration of the mind. And at one point the Buddha says this. He says, any concentration that is accompanied by the other 7 path factors is right concentration, which is, of course, that's the key. You know, you're focused, but do you also have right mindfulness? Right view? Right thought, and so on. And there's lots of ways to accomplish this. But ultimately they must involve mindfulness. It means awareness of reality. Because they must involve the 3 characteristics and must involve a clear understanding of suffering. Parinya, right? When we talked about the first noble truth. The path is not to avoid suffering and enter into blissful states. It's about letting go of suffering. Well, it's about understanding suffering. And when you see that it's suffering, you let go of it. You stop clinging to it. So, hopefully I haven't confused you all even more, but concentration is something that comes through the practice. It's something that involves seeing things clearly. You know, another way of translating it is right focus. When your mind is in focus means you can see things clearly. And that's important because concentration in the threefold training is what leads to wisdom. We have sila, morality or ethics leads to concentration. Concentration, samadhi leads to wisdom. So it involves focus. It means you focus your attention, not too hard, just right, so that you can see things, just perfect focus, so you can see things as they are. That's right concentration.